much, John. Sorry, just unmuting there. And it's a pleasure to be here with you and with Antonio. I don't think we need much more introduction. I'm Dulcie, the data science lead, and Antonio's here as the co-lead of our scoping, selection, and impact committee. So today, first, we're just going to find out a little bit about who is here. I see that there's almost 200 folks in attendance, which is amazing. And then we'll tell you a little bit about the types of programs that we run at DataKind and some case studies, types of data for good projects that we tend to see. And then lastly, Antonio is going to tell you kind of the key learnings that we've made over the past 7 years in terms of what makes a good data for good project, how to choose projects, what a good project question looks like, and tell you a little bit about the data maturity framework. And that relates to our belief that data science is a journey, and we want to kind of build up organizations' data science capacity, and we use this framework to help us understand that process. So first, I see that Jess has loaded the first poll for us. So we were curious who's here, whether you are all data scientists or other. It looks like about a quarter of the people who've responded are data scientists. And then we've got some data engineers, again, nearly a quarter data analysts, business analysts, some students in the audience, and then 27% are none of the above. So that's kind of interesting as well. And Jess, could you maybe open the second poll so we can find out where you're coming from? So here we wanted to know what sector are you working in, whether you're working in the for-profit sector, whether you're working in a nonprofit, social sector, government, not yet working, or in another sector altogether. All right, so interestingly, about half the people here work in for-profits, which is a large source of our volunteer community, so that's great. We've got 18% working in the nonprofit sector. I'm definitely curious to know if those are data science folks, and I'll tell you a bit about one of our programs designed just for you. Then we have some people in government, some students, and other, but overwhelmingly in the for-profit sector, which is, I think, what we suspected. So that's interesting, though. So that's a little bit about you. Now a little bit about us. So as John said at the beginning, we are a charity ourselves, and our goal is to build the capacity of social change organizations to do data science. And what is a social change organization? That is our umbrella term for charities, social enterprises, local government, and the like, working in the social sector. So now a little bit about what we do. We offer a range of programs from very light touch support to year-long projects, and the majority of this is free, and that is because of our amazing volunteer community. So the lighter touch side of things, we run an office hours program for nonprofits, and this is pretty open-ended. Nonprofits can come to us with any data questions, whether it's strategic or technical. So some of the questions that we get asked routinely are like very high level, what data should I be collecting about the clients who make use of our services? How can I think about integrating the different bits of data that I collect, whether it's from Google Analytics or the CRM that the organization is using, into a sort of coherent story. But then we also get quite technical questions as well, which is interesting. So just on Wednesday at our last office hours, we had a charity come in wanting to get some advice on the more theoretical considerations and assumptions you need to consider when doing clustering or segmentation. And we've had people come in and ask similarly about getting started with Power BI or Python for the first time. The kind of bulk of our program, though, is a bit longer term. So these are our data dives. These are short-term projects that focus on exploratory analysis and prototyping, but also importantly, just building up the capacity of the organization and inspiring them to think about getting more out of their data. So in these programs, volunteer data scientists spend about 6 weeks working with charities to define and nail down the most important data questions to the organization. And these are questions that really affect the activities or strategy of our partner organizations. They then prep and clean the data with the charity partners, and it culminates in this intense 2-day hackathon style event that brings together volunteer data scientists from all sorts of sectors and the social change organization partner to tackle those specific challenges. And in terms of what questions tend to get asked at these, we often are working with service delivery organizations. They are often interested in questions around who are our users? Are we reaching the most vulnerable populations in our community? Can we group or cluster our clients based on client features or activity patterns? Can we predict need better? Is our program working, and for whom? Those are the sorts of questions that we try to explore at a data dive. And then sometimes off the back of a successful data dive, we can roll some of the work into a longer project, which we call our data core. And this is where we try to operationalize or implement something. So one example I'll tell you about a bit later is where we worked with a food bank who wanted to develop a model that would help them predict client dependency. And that was a model that got built into their business as usual, rather than something kind of more exploratory from a data dive weekend. The fourth program that we run is our Social Data Society. And for those folks who said that they are coming from a nonprofit and who are also data scientists, this might be the right space for you. So we've noticed one of the things that we've learned is that data analysts, data scientists who work in the social sector can often be islands, and they don't necessarily have a community to help them tackle challenges, to brainstorm ideas about how to approach a different problem, or even just to give technical advice. So the Social Data Society is a peer network of data scientists working in the social sector, and it's a place where they can come and have a kind of community of data literate colleagues. We bring in external speakers as well to speak on topics of their request. And then lastly, one of our core missions is to help foster dialogue about responsible data use. So we do that not just kind of internally through our training with our volunteers, but also externally when we can through reports or advisory roles, including this recent report that we did with the Ada Lovelace Institute, looking at algorithmic fairness and examining algorithmic audits. In terms of who we work for and with, we have worked with social change organizations, both big and small. So you'll see some that you recognize here, like Oxfam, the Amnesty Internationals of the world, Citizens Advice. But we also have worked with some very small organizations like the Welcome Center, which is a small food bank in Huddersfield, and smaller organizations as well. So how can social change organizations use data science? What does a good data for good project look like? What we found is that most of our projects fall into one of about 5 buckets. So there may be others out there, but for us, this is the types of projects that we found are helpful to the charity partners we work with. So understanding need and demand, understanding who clients are and what patterns they might exhibit, influencing policy or campaigning effectively, evaluating the efficacy of your organization's services, and improving operational efficiency. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of those. So in terms of understanding need and demand, this is actually a recent project that we did a few weeks ago with Citizens Advice Lewisham. I'm not sure how many non-UK folks we have here, but Citizens Advice Lewisham are one of the Citizens Advice bureaus, and they, as part of Advice Lewisham, provide support and advice on a range of issues across the borough. And they were concerned that they were potentially not reaching the most vulnerable people in their community. So for this, we used some open data on the indices of multiple deprivation, which is a government metric that captures 7 different kind of domains of deprivation and vulnerability, ranging from income, employment, health, crime. And the map on the left shows the borough of Lewisham, colored by the relative deprivation level. So the red areas are amongst the least deprived parts of Lewisham Borough, and yellow is the most deprived. So you can see that there's a higher deprivation in the south part of the borough, and along in the middle a bit as well, a bit in the north too. But what was really striking was when we compared this to where the cases come from at Citizens Advice Lewisham. So that's the map on the right, and it looks at where CAL's clients were coming from as total cases per capita. Again, the yellow indicates areas where the caseload was highest proportionally, and red being the lowest proportionally. And strikingly, this shows that Citizens Advice Lewisham really is seeing more cases from those more vulnerable areas. And this was helpful for them just to be certain that they are reaching those clients, and also helping them advocate for continued funding to do so. Another common challenge for social change organizations is understanding clients and their client journey. So this is a project that we did with DataKind UK. They provide advice and grants to children and families. And they had a hunch that there were kind of common sequences of requests for support. So when clients came in with one request, you might see them 6 months later with a different category of request. For example, families who were getting grants on the grounds of domestic violence, they had a hunch that they would also often see them down the line for grants related to child health. And so they wanted to understand how the requests from their clients were connected. So this project looked at the sequence of requests and where the sort of trajectory that clients were likely to take. The size of the bubble or the circle is the number of requests, and the arrow, of course, indicates the order. And so here, the volunteers found that families asking about child health were quite likely to go on to then ask questions about parental mental health, and that could lead down the line to questions around domestic abuse, which itself led to questions and support around homelessness and estrangement. So while a difficult trajectory to tackle, this was helpful for Buttle in thinking about triaging some of these needs and providing additional support. A third area that we've seen projects in is influencing policy and enabling organizations to campaign more effectively, whether it's about their impact or something slightly different altogether. So this was a project with Global Witness, and apologies that the text is a bit small, but I'll try to tell you the story. So this project was actually made possible by a change in legislation in, I think, around 2016. So in 2016, the UK introduced a fully open register of the real owners of companies. And so this, for the first time, enabled anyone really to figure out who the registered owners were of companies. So Global Witness wanted to use this data to try to identify suspicious companies, so anonymous or shell companies. And the team did this using graph analysis of the open companies data to understand how companies were connected to each other. So in this project, various metrics were used, but this is showing postcode. There's 2 unique postcodes in the yellow circles, and then all the companies shown in purple green had beneficial owners, which were registered to this postcode. So in this case, I don't know the number, but many beneficial owners were registered to the same postcode. This analysis also revealed that there were several thousand owners under the age of 2, one that hadn't been born, and that 5 owners controlled over 6,000 companies. So this was really useful for Global Witness in campaigning. Through this, there were a number of policy changes, including changing the way that the company's house data is actually collected and validated, and then also some additional legislative reform. Fingers crossed, I don't know how this is going to go in 2020, but theoretically, some of the overseas territories were now required to make the real owners public. So a pretty powerful impact of this project. Another very common problem we see tackled in our projects is evaluating the impact of services and asking whether those work equally well for all of your clients. So this is a project that we did with Clymai. They are a Welsh charity who are working to reduce youth homelessness. And they were interested in the sort of simple question of who is doing well and not so well in our services. So quite a simple approach, but it had a kind of powerful impact for them. So the approach was just segmenting the users based on whether they were a care leaver, a youth offender, and their gender. And so for each user, looked at the impact of the program, whether it was excellent or just kind of met expectations. So on the left, you can see that women especially, but also men who were not youth offenders and not care leavers had quite a high proportion with excellent impact levels. So 3/4 of females who were not youth offenders or care leavers had an excellent outcome. Whereas when they looked at the male youth offenders who had also been in care, only about 1/3 of those had excellent outcomes. And this kind of was in line with a hunch that Clymai had, that young men who had an experience of offending and being in care were doing worse in their programs. So it didn't tell them why, but it did give them some cause to investigate and potentially think about how to better support those clients. So the last story I'll tell you about is a project looking at improving operational efficiency. So this was a project with the Welcome Center, who I had mentioned earlier, who are a small food bank. And they noticed that while the majority of their clients were coming in to the food bank a few times, there were some who would come in, say, 15, 20 times or more. And they were concerned that some clients were becoming dependent on their services. And they did have a support worker who could offer these clients some additional support, but that's quite a limited resource. So what they wanted to do was develop a predictive model to predict who from their clients was at risk of dependency. And so this was actually one of our data core projects, and it got operationalized again into their daily work, where we developed a model that gave each client a risk score, and that could be used as a factor for the support workers in thinking about whether to triage this client for additional support. So this is a figure looking at the impact of this work. So looking at the average referrals that the Welcome Center was receiving for each client over time. And the orange arrow indicates when the risk score model was rolled out in in 2018, where you see the line starting to plateau. So again, not causal, but we're hopeful that this indicates that by being able to predict who might be at risk of dependency, they're able to prioritize some clients for additional support. So those are some of the stories of the types of projects that we've worked on, and through those years of work, we've learned some lessons about kind of how to best work with social change organizations and what the ingredients are of a good project. So I will pass over to Antonio to tell you some of those lessons.
Thanks, Dulcie. Can you hear me? I'll take it as a yes.
We can hear you, Antonio.
Thanks. As Dulcie mentioned, after executing and scoping all those projects over the years, there's a couple of lessons we learned that I think in the spirit of lunch and learn would be good to share with you guys. And I think those lessons are universal and are even beyond the scope of the nonprofit sector. But they're even more important when you're working with social change organizations, because often they have limited resources. The data that you're working on is about vulnerable people, so it's very important to actually be careful about a couple of steps when you're scoping projects. If you can go to the next slide. And the first lesson, again, which is universal, is we have to start with a problem, not with a data set. It's very, very easy to look at a data set which is big, which has a lot of features, a lot of columns, get excited about and say, wow, I can do so much about this. But of course, we have to sit down with the charity, with the organization, and understand what are the problems that are actually going to matter, going to help them fulfill their mission more effectively. If you can go to the next slide. And when you're scoping projects, and again, not only with nonprofits, but in particular, in our case, problems often come not in a specific and actionable way. So the points that we try to make sure when you're scoping those projects is to make sure that problems are specific, actionable, and they actually identify and they fill a knowledge gap in the charity. For example, very typically a project comes to us with questions like, who are our users, or which of our services are successful? And those are great, like, high-level questions, but they're not answerable. So you have to polish those questions to make them, we have this phrase, data diveable, to make them data scienceable, and effectively to make them answerable. For example, by trying to understand, so what is the exactly characteristics of the users that we're trying to understand? We're trying to understand what the proportion of our users are female, for example. And a great question usually relates to the overall mission of the charity. And it has a specific flow of, like, if the charity knew that the proportion is that, then it would enable them to target them more, or to do Y. So relating to the overall mission, or for the folks that work in the third sector, to the theory of change of the charity, it makes for a very good problem. And again, identifying a knowledge gap, something that a charity doesn't know, or maybe even a hunch or hypothesis. Those are great questions. If you can phrase questions in terms of a hypothesis, for example, in the case that Dulcie mentioned, is it true that we are serving the most vulnerable? Then you can actually go there and use the hypothesis and investigate the hypothesis using data science techniques. If you can go to the next slide. And that's one example of an interesting question that for a project that we did with StreetLink. StreetLink connect rough sleepers to local services via referrals from the public, and they wanted to understand what are the external factors that predict referrals. So in principle, you would have a list of possible candidates for external factors, and you wanted to understand whether does this influence the volume of referrals or not. This is a great question because it's relatively open-ended, so it doesn't cut the creativity of the volunteers, but it is answerable. It has a possible answer. And the same for what features predict the outcome and what factors might affect who is submitting a referral or not. If you can go to the next slide. And while scoping the problem, after you come up with a set of great questions, it's very important to ask questions about what can go wrong. So what could happen with the project? And again, this is important even in the for-profit, but here often the data sets are about vulnerable people. Often people have been we risk people being missed out of the analysis, and I think this is a higher risk when you're working with the third sector. So these are the questions that we actually answer in the committee when we are. Those are questions that we actually answer in the committee when you're scoping this question. So who will be positively affected, but maybe more importantly, who might be negatively affected. See, if I find out that one group is imbalanced in terms of referrals, let's say, what is going to be the action, and does that risk having possible unintended consequences? And what happens if your model is not as accurate? How do you communicate that? And on top of data protection, on top of the level of data protection that you need for compliance, it's useful to think, are you using the data for something that the people who provided the data actually would agree with? And again, this is even more important because data subjects in this case are often vulnerable people. And are there any risks with data? What are the risks in terms of ethical consequences? And if you go to the next slide. And third, I suppose the third lesson, after we come up with a good set of problems, we know what are the intended and the unintended consequences of our project. It's kind of a humbling experience of, so you as a volunteer are usually an expert in data science, but not in the theory of change, not in the mission of the charity. So it's very important to sit down with the charity, to talk to them, to understand what exactly their requirements, and to really understand that they are the experts they have domain expertise, and you're bringing on your analytical skills. And for the next slide, please. And the fourth point, the one before the last, is don't be too flashy. And don't get me wrong, this is not saying that there's no space for beautiful visualizations. We like beautiful visualizations if they're engaging, if they can build engagement and trust. This is more about understanding the requirements again of the charities and meeting those requirements with the simplest possible model. So the simplest possible model is usually preferred. And this is an example of a project where this was very important. This is a project with a Welcome Center, the Dulce mentioned, who is a food bank. They wanted to figure out what is the likelihood that someone that comes from the food bank is going to become dependent on the food bank. And the volunteers came up with this model to predict a future usage of the services. And if you can go to the next slide. But the problem is the requirements were quite hard. So the whole charity system was in Windows in a system written in BASIC, which I don't really know exactly what it is. And it had to run with zero maintenance. There's no software developer to maintain that, and the staff had to understand that. So that's the solution that they came up with in order to show what is the likelihood that someone's going to come again to the service. Is not flashy, but it does exactly what it does, and most importantly, they built a solution for where the charity are in terms of maturity, and not where the charity wants to be. If they had gone down through a route of, I want to implement the latest deep learning model that needs a graphic processing unit with 16 core, they wouldn't be able to deliver this project. And that brings us to the next and last step or last lesson that we learn, is that it's very important to think about where the charities, where the organizations are in terms of data maturity. And because building data science capacity is so important to DataKind UK, and it's so important for scoping projects, for evaluating impact of our services, but also evaluating where the charities are in terms of their data journey, we actually developed a framework together with Data Orchard in 2017 to quantify, to put a number, because we're data geeks who like to give numbers to things, to give it a number of in terms of what is the data maturity of an organization. So this is a framework which is available for nonprofit use under Creative Commons. And it describes their maturity in terms of 7 key areas, uses data analysis, and 5 stages from unaware organizations, which are organizations who don't do anything in that thing, to mastering organizations who are actually very good at that specific competency or that specific key. For instance, let me give you an example of analysis. So a charity that is unaware of analysis probably doesn't do any type of analysis besides like basic counts of number of clients, maybe finances. Whereas a charity that is mastering uses analytical tools from various like descriptive, prescriptive, forecasting, optimization to understand the services and to allocate resources. If you go to the next slide. And the way we operationalized the maturity framework was to actually assess charities. So for every project that we run, we have two of my fellow committee members having a call with the charity to actually try and understand, trying to give a score for each of the theme where the charities are. And for example, if we want to understand where, what is the level of, what is the stage, journey stage of a charity in terms of uses, we're going to ask, what, can you give me an example of when you use data to record activities or to evidence the needs for your services? Or in terms of analytical techniques, what kind of analytics do you use? Do you use forecasting? Do you use dashboard? Do you use descriptive analytics? Another very important point is leadership. From one side of the scope is a charity that's completely unaware of leadership. That's leadership doesn't care about data, doesn't think that data is important, is not willing to use data for decisions. To the other side of mastering organizations that typically have someone who is either a data expert or who understands very well data on the leadership team and who invests and who's willing to use data to take decisions and to question their practices. And we also try to understand where they are, what kind of data skills do they have? Do they have a data analyst, someone that takes care of the warehouse, someone that takes care of collecting data, or do they have a data scientist? And if you go to the next slide, this is kind of hot off the press. We analyzed the charities that we worked with, that we scoped projects in the last year, trying to figure out where they are in the data maturity journey. And the graph that you see on the left is the stages of data maturity. As you can see, most of them are either in the learning or developing stages. So they have some of the skills are well developed, and some of them we would like to help develop. But the striking, I think the most striking finding from this exercise was that if you compare what is the highest scores in terms of data maturity themes and the lowest scores, virtually all, or exactly all of them, have skills as one of the lowest scores. So most of them have good tools. They have a good CRM system. They collect data from different sources. Sometimes the data is not that well maintained, could be improved, the data collection, but tools are usually a strength. But skills are the striking theme of data maturity that shows up as a weakness for all. As a lowest, one of the lowest scores for the charities we work with. And just to wrap up, the sort of lessons, an ideal data for good project has a well-framed problem, a solution that is simple and actionable. It has the relevant data and a social actor partner, and you sat down with the social actor partner, you understood what's their mission, what's the theory of change, how they're going to action if we answer the questions. But on top of all that, and if you follow the data maturity discussions, many of this, a good Data for Good project has volunteers. As I mentioned, many of those charities, they have tools, they have some data, they're trying to understand some questions that want to advance their mission, but they lack the skills, and that's where you come in. So we love data science volunteers. We have over 600 people in our Slack channel, over 40 core community volunteers like myself. And we always want more volunteers. So if you want to get involved, get in touch with the team, and that's it.
Great, thank you very much, Antonio. Antonio and Dulcie, we have a lot of questions coming up. So excellent, thank you for turning on your video, Dulcie, that's fantastic. So we have a lot of questions coming up, as I say, and quite a few of them are related to how do I become part of the Social Data Society, which was asked by Tom Brown, and others asking similar questions. So you, Antonio, just mentioned that you have a Slack channel. Maybe we could point everyone to your Slack channel. Dulcie, Antonio, you'll be welcome to add it into the chat thread if you want to, or if you send it to me or to Amy or Jess, we can also put it on the thread. So Antonio, what is your Slack channel, please?
I'll let Dulcie take that one.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. My apologies.
Yeah, I'll just put it in the chat. So the best way to get involved with the Social Data Society, which is our community for data scientists who work in the social sector, is actually just to shoot me an email. So the only requirements to join the Social Data Society are that you are a data scientist or an aspiring data scientist, data analyst type, somebody who works with data daily, and that you work in a charity or social enterprise. Unfortunately, we're a bit protective of the space, so it's not for people looking to get in there into that. So that's for the Social Data Society. For getting involved with our community in general, we do have the best place to go for that is actually our website, and I'll put that in the chat as well. And there's a form there that you can fill out with just a bit about yourself, and then we can add you to our mailing list and Slack and all of that. So I'll put both of those in the chat right now.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That's excellent. Okay, so from the top, in no particular order of importance, actually, Mel Dye, I think it is. I'll leave it to you guys to decide who is best to answer it, by the way. The question is, how sensitive is the data, and can these projects be used to build a personal project portfolio? Do you want me to tackle that one, Antonio? Do you want to tackle that one?
We can
you
both
go for it.
So the data is usually very sensitive. It's about the vulnerable vulnerable people, the data subjects. We have to deal with quite a lot of data protection and all those agreements. So most of the projects are with proprietary data. That said, there are some initiatives of maybe outside DataKind, or some of the data sets that we use that are external that could be used in other projects. But I'd say that most of them are actually proprietary and quite sensitive.
I think that, so I would add just a couple of things to Antonio's very excellent point about this data reflecting humans who often are quite vulnerable humans, and that is that we make sure that the charity partners that we work with are the controllers of both the data at all times and then also of the results. So all of our participants at data dives and that sort of thing, we ask them to sign a non-disclosure agreement because we need this to be a safe space for the organizations to explore their data. They may very well find out that some of their programs are not working well, and that's important information. We need to protect the space for them to do that. So we don't permit anyone other than the charities to sort of share results unless prior consent is obtained. So you can't kind of use the actual results in that way to build a portfolio, but our volunteers are encouraged to sort of put this sort of experience on their CVs, absolutely.
Interesting, thank you very much. So actually that perfectly leads on to a question that I have. There's been a lot of talk in the press over the last year or so about bias, you know, in all forms of life. But in the tech press, I've seen an increasing amount of discussion about you know, what can be done in data science to reduce bias in results. And I was just wondering what steps you guys might take at a high level to reduce bias, you know, of any type of bias, racial, sexual, any type of bias in the results that you see.
You can take that one in.
Yeah, sure. So one of the practical steps that we've taken really recently that I'm quite excited about is our ethics committee. So we have several different committees of core volunteers who help us run our programs because we're quite a small staff team. We're only 4. So we have a scoping committee, we have a community committee, we have a programs committee that helps sort of think about the impact of our programs more generally. We have our office hours committee, and then we have our ethics committee. And one of the projects that our ethics committee took on this year was evaluating tools for reducing bias in various contexts. So for example, they tested out some different tools for using word embeddings in free text data, and evaluated kind of any bias that might be present in there, and they applied this to other kind of algorithms or frameworks that might be used. And so they're working on a practitioner's guidebook to some of the options available there for to sort of reduce bias in terms of not the algorithms, but the data itself. We are quite conscious of bias that might exist in the data, especially in how it was collected. So we ask our volunteers to try to make this as open a conversation as possible with the charities. We have a series of checklists to go through that have been developed again by our ethics committee, and they ask questions like who wasn't included in this data, who might not be represented. For example, if the data requires you to have a mobile phone in order to respond to some sort of survey, are you missing people who don't have that kind of digital access? So those are the kind of practical tips that we try to implement.
Yeah, interesting. It's interesting to hear that you have an ethics committee, because I think this is going to become a much more prevalent problem in the future. To your earlier point about you know, analysing this data, we've got a question from Dan Welsh. I think he's a tech geek like myself, because his question is, what tool was used to create the visualizations in your presentations?
Various. I think that each visualization comes from a different project. So each visualization comes from a different, from a different tool. In terms of which tools our volunteers use, it ranges from visualizations, Tableau, Power BI, more conventional like mapping tools like GIS, Python, R. Shiny is a beloved tool to build dashboards for people who like R. and really anything. Every time I go to a data dive, I learn a new tool to visualize data differently.
That's exactly what I find as well. I'm forever learning new tools, indeed. So we have a question from David Laughlin. Great talk, thank you very much. What is the typical length of a project that DataKind get involved with? And is there an expected time commitment from volunteers per month?
I can tackle this one. So the projects that we run, the data dives are usually about 6 to 8 weeks. So we have kind of different levels of volunteering in terms of commitment. So the data ambassadors, who are the core volunteers who work with the charity for those 6 to 8 weeks, prepping everything for the weekend, they volunteer about 4 to 5 hours a week over that 8-week period. And they tend to be people who've come to a data dive before. The data dive weekend itself, when we run those, it's a full weekend, but you're not required to kind of do anything before or after. So that's a full day Saturday and then Sunday 9 to 4. So if you're looking to kind of get involved in a more on a more slight casual basis, I would encourage you to sign up to our mailing list, and that's how you would learn about the next data dive. And then we have a smaller community of core volunteers like Antonio. Antonio, I don't want to even guess how many hours a week you put into DataKind, but that tends to be a bit of a longer commitment. There's monthly committee meetings, and then there'll be some things in between, such as like reading and reviewing projects. So that's a longer term engagement. And then our data core projects are about 4 to 5 hours a week for anywhere from 6 to 12 months.
Great, thank you very much, Darcy. Yeah, so that's perfectly achievable even for some tech geeks who work long hours anyway in their jobs. So Katie Clark asks, will you be arranging any hackathons online moving forward? She'd love to get involved.
Yes. Actually, we have fully moved online this past year. Thank you, coronavirus. So we, I think, are mastering the art of the virtual data dive.
Actually, Darcy, sorry to interrupt, because you've perfectly led into our next question as well. So you might like to ask them both, because Julia has asked, how has COVID affected your work? So everything's moved online, I'm sure. So you might like to answer both questions at the same time.
Yes, so I feel like the impact of COVID has been, I guess I can start with that, because it's been striking how the charitable sector has been impacted. So we've been quite lucky that we were able to adapt our events online, but the charitable sector has been kind of hugely impacted by coronavirus, both in terms of seeing a huge increase in the need for their services, and then also so many people being furloughed and not able to work. So that's been really challenging. And so the types of needs that we have seen over the course of this pandemic has varied. In the beginning, there was a huge need for digital support for charities, and data just wasn't a priority. And now we're seeing organizations coming back and having a bit more capacity for that. So I think that's been the main thing, is just like the impact of this pandemic on the charity sector. And so in terms of how it's affected us, we've pivoted to having virtual data dives, which has been great to involve people outside of London, or even sometimes outside the UK. And we are planning on running some more in 2021. So the best way to stay in touch with those is to sign up for our mailing list on our website.
Perfect, thank you very much. That's a good answer. So one quick question, which I think I will answer on your behalf. Tom has asked, how do I get one of those cool Data for Good t-shirts, Antonio? So I'm guessing he should sign up and get in touch with you guys and start volunteering. Next one is Robin. Would it be possible to do an A+B test on the dependency machine learning use case to see whether the model has a real impact? So I guess that's sort of overall, how do you test your models? How do you test the results of your engagement in projects?
I guess I don't know, Antonio, if you have thoughts on this. I don't know how it was necessarily done for the Welcome Center case. But one thing that you do have to consider is like, it's a little bit like a clinical trial insofar as if you anticipate that you, like if you know that something is likely to work quite well, you have to consider the ethics of withholding that. In the case of triaging people for support versus not triaging some of those people, you'd have to really consider whether like the sort of responsibility of that. And so sometimes the sort of most scientifically robust approach might not be the most sort of socially responsible approach. But Antonio, did you have any additional guidance?
Whenever it's possible, yes, 100% about doing A/B testing and following customer satisfaction. It depends on a project by project basis, really. What is the follow-up that you're gonna have? For some projects where you're trying to actually, understand users or uncover hidden patterns, it's a bit less. I think A/B testing a bit less applicable, but it's often something that you have to figure out on a project by project basis, I suppose.
Yes, okay, I can completely understand that. Thank you. Okay, so we have a whole group of questions that are all related. I'm going to leave towards the end. Do you recruit volunteers from abroad? For example, Suniana is asking from Germany.
I suppose I should probably tackle that one. So we don't explicitly recruit volunteers from abroad, but it's not in this new world order. It's certainly not out of the question. It can be difficult sometimes if there's a big time zone difference, but Germany is not that far away. So I think you are more than welcome to sign up as well. And they, on our volunteer page on the website, there's a bit called Not in the UK. So there are similar organizations around the world. Some of them are DataKind chapters. Some of them are just similar like-minded organizations. So if you go to that website, you might be able to find someone closer to you.
Just to add a small point to that, if you're from Singapore, the US, DataKind has chapters, so DataKind UK is part of a global network. So you might be able to connect to those local organizations. Singapore, US, Bangalore. I don't know if I missed any.
Thank you very much. No, that's good. Okay, so Oliver's got a great question. So we have about 3 or 4 minutes left. So a quick answer to this question, then we have one more and we will wrap up. But what do you think are the key barriers preventing more charities getting the most out of your expertise?
Ooh. Maybe I can start answering, and then Dulce is gonna complement with anything I forget. There's a couple. When we did all the the data maturity assessment of the charities that we worked with, the couple of different barriers, starting with skills, really, like the charities just don't have the skill to operationalize the findings. Sometimes they come up with a very good model, but then it's just hard for them to take the model and to use the insights and reproduce it on a regular basis. Sometimes there's a culture barrier, really. People prefer to use anecdotal information than data, and that's kind of a hard one. It's a long game, but it is possible to change. We've seen sometimes leadership, and the leadership is not engaged, or there's no data champion within the leadership team. There are a couple of different barriers, I suppose, for each theme of the data maturity framework can be seen as one on one side, one barrier for adoption of data or data science, really. But maybe you can chime in, Lucy.
Yeah, I think the culture one's a really big one. I would certainly agree with that. I think there can also be sort of related to that, like a barrier in the sense that data is seen as something that you do for funders, as a sort of not a box ticking exercise, but that there's very like sort of strict sometimes reporting requirements for funders, and so doing anything above and beyond what is required can be difficult, especially if your organization is small and under-resourced. So I think that can also be a barrier. And then I think also just a fear of, doing something wrong and using data irresponsibly. I think the social sector is learning that they're not immune to the challenges of using data responsibly. And there's a lot of stories out there, especially recently, about questionable data use. So I think there can be some more hesitation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, okay, we have a few more questions left. Genrose, interestingly, I've just seen, was asking about bias, which obviously I asked earlier. So I'm going to mark that as answered live. So one last question. Do you have, what types of skill in particular, data science skills in particular, are you looking for? And the final question, I think, is a summary of what a lot of people have been asking today is, do you have any recommendations for tech geeks like myself wanting to volunteer, other than to email Dulcie? So yes, over to you.
I'll answer the first one because it's easier, and I'll let Dulcie answer the second one. Or you can email that. No, it's a great question, actually, and I often talk to people and they're like, "Oh, I only know how to do data engineering. Like, should I volunteer?" I'm like, what do you mean? You should volunteer. So we basically we usually search for a broad range of skills. Sometimes projects such as data cores have specific skills that we need. If the project is about free text, we need natural language processing. If the project is about forecasting, we might need like some time series expertise. But in general, we need a broad range of skills because the questions that we ask are broad enough that can be answered by different types with different types of analytics. So, for instance, skills that usually are very important during a data dive are dashboarding, data visualization, spatial mapping is one that has been becoming more and more important recently. And general machine learning skills, forecasting, modeling, data cleaning, web scraping, really a broad range of skills that we're looking for.
Great.
Yeah, we have volunteers from a number of different sectors. We do tend to look for folks who have a few years experience in whatever sector they work in. In terms of other places to look, there are some other similar Slack channels which I will put that are totally open that I'll put in the chat. There's the AI for Good community. There's also the Digital for Good community and Tech for Good community. And I think there's also, I forget exactly the name, but for the women and non-binary folks, there's a Open Heroines community as well.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Dulcie and Antonio, thank you very much for excellent presentation. We have been overwhelmed with questions. I think we've answered most of the questions. You guys have answered most of the questions. If anybody has any more questions or any unanswered questions, please feel free to connect to the Data Science Festival Slack channel and ask your questions there. So I'd like to thank Dulcie and Antonio for their time today. I'd also like to thank the Data Science Festival for arranging these talks, and also the sponsors for basically paying for all of the infrastructure behind this and making it possible. In particular, I'd like to thank Jess and Amy for their great organisation skills. So please check out the Data Science Festival website for more great talks over the coming weeks. Thank you very much, and goodbye everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.